Welcome to Andy Reads the Bible, where we're reading through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation in 1 year. I'm your host, Andy Brassfield. Today is January the 5th, and I'll be reading Genesis chapter 14, verse 13, through chapter 18, verse 15 from the Message translation. Genesis chapter 14, starting at verse 13. A fugitive came and reported to Abram the Hebrew. Abram was living at the oaks of Mamrie, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Anar. They were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his nephew had been taken prisoner, he lined up his servants, all of them born in his household. There were 318 of them, and chased after the captors all the way to Dan. Abram and his men split into small groups and attacked by night. They chased them as far as Hobah, just north of Damascus. They recovered all the plunder along with nephew Lot and his possessions, including the women and the people. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and his allied kings, the king of Sodom came out to greet him in the valley of Shaveh, the king's valley. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of the high God and blessed him. Blessed be Abram by the high God, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be the high God who handed your enemies over to you. Abram gave him a tenth of all the recovered plunder. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me back the people, but keep all the plunder for yourself." But Abram told the king of Sodom, "I swear to God, the high God, creator of heaven and earth, this solemn oath, that I'll take nothing from you, not so much as a thread or a shoestring. I'm not going to have you go around saying I made Abram rich. Nothing for me other than what the young men ate and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamrie. They're to get their share of the plunder." Chapter 15. After all these things, this word of God came to Abram in a vision. "Don't be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield. Your reward will be grand." Abram said, "God, Master, what use are your gifts as long as I'm childless, and Eleazar of Damascus is going to inherit everything?" Abram continued, "See, you've given me no children, and now a mere house servant is going to get it all." Then God's message came. "Don't worry, he won't be your heir. A son from your body will be your heir." Then he took him outside and said, "Look at the sky, count the stars. Can you count? Can you count it? Count your descendants. You're going to have a big family, Abram." And he believed God. God declared him set right with God. God continued, "I'm the same God who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldees and gave you this land to own." Abram said, "Master God, how am I to know this, that it will all be mine?" God said, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, and a dove and a young pigeon." He brought all these animals to him, split them down the middle, and laid the halves opposite each other. But he didn't split the birds. Vultures swooped down on the carcasses, but Abram scared them off. As the sun went down, a deep sleep came over Abram, and then a sense of dread, dark and heavy. God said to Abram, "Know this, your descendants will live as outsiders in a land not theirs. They'll be enslaved and beaten down for 400 years. Then I'll punish their slave masters. Your offspring will march out of there loaded with plunder, but not you. You'll have a long and full life and die a good and peaceful death. Not until the 4th generation will your descendants return here. Sin is still a thriving business among the Amorites. When the sun was down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch moved between the split carcasses. That's when God made a covenant with Abram. I'm giving this land to your children from the Nile River in Egypt to the river Euphrates in Assyria, the country of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Chapter 16. Sarai, Abram's wife, hadn't produced a child. She had an Egyptian maid named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, God has not seen fit to let me have a child. Sleep with my maid. Maybe I can get a family from her. Abram agreed to do what Sarai said. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took her Egyptian maid Hagar and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. Abram had been living 10 years in Canaan when this took place. He slept with Hagar, and she got pregnant. When Hagar learned she was pregnant, she looked down on her mistress. Sarai told Abram, "It's all your fault that I'm suffering this abuse. I put my maid in bed with you, and the minute she knows she's pregnant, she treats me like I'm nothing. May God decide which of us is right." "You decide," said Abram. "Your maid is your business." Sarai was abusive to Hagar, and Hagar ran away. An angel of God found her beside a spring in the desert. It was the spring on the road to Shur. He said, "Hagar, maid of Sarai, what are you doing here?" She said, "I'm running away from Sarai, my mistress." The angel of God said, "Go back to your mistress, but put up with her abuse." He continued, "I'm going to give you a big family, children past counting. From this pregnancy you'll get a son. Name him Ishmael. For God heard you, God answered you. He'll be a bucking bronco of a man, a real fighter, fighting and being fought, always stirring up trouble, always at odds with his family." She answered God by name, praying to the God who spoke to her, "You're the God who sees me." Yes, he saw me, and then I saw him. That's how that desert spring got named God Alive Sees Me Spring. That spring is still there, between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar gave Abram a son. Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar gave him his son Ishmael. Chapter 17. When Abram was 99 years old, God showed up and said to him, "I am the strong God. Live entirely before me. Live to the hilt. I'll make a covenant between us, and I'll give you a huge family." Overwhelmed, Abram fell flat on his face. Then God said to him, "This is my covenant with you. You'll be the father of many nations. Your name will no longer be Abram, but Abraham, meaning that I'm making you the father of many nations. I'll make you a father of fathers. I'll make nations from you. Kings will issue from you. I'm establishing my covenant between me and you, a covenant that includes your descendants, a covenant that goes on and on and on, a covenant that commits me to be your God and the God of your descendants. And I'm giving you and your descendants this land where you're now just camping, this whole country of Canaan, to own forever and I'll be their God. God continued to Abraham, and you will honor my covenant, you and your descendants, generation after generation. This is the covenant that you are to honor, the covenant that pulls in all your descendants. Circumcise every male. Circumcise by cutting off the foreskin of the penis. It will be the sign of the covenant between us. Every male baby will be circumcised when he is 8 days old, generation after generation. This includes house-born slaves and slaves bought from outsiders who are not blood kin. Make sure you circumcise both your own children and anyone brought in from the outside. That way my covenant will be cut into your body, a permanent mark of my permanent covenant. An uncircumcised male who has not had the foreskin of his penis cut off will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. God continued speaking to Abraham. And Sarai, your wife, don't call her Sarai any longer. Call her Sarah. I'll bless her. Yes, I'll give you a son by her. Oh, how I'll bless her. Nations will come from her. Kings of nations will come from her. Abraham fell flat on his face, and then he laughed, thinking, can a 100-year-old man father a child? And can Sarah, at 90 years old, have a baby? Recovering, Abraham said to God, Oh, keep Ishmael alive and well before you. But God said, That's not what I mean. Your wife Sarah will have a baby, a son. Name him Isaac. Laughter. I'll establish my covenant with him and his descendants, a covenant that lasts forever. And Ishmael? Yes, I heard your prayer for him. I'll also bless him. I'll make sure he has plenty of children, a huge family. He'll father 12 princes. I'll make him a great nation, but I'll establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will give you about this time next year. God finished speaking with Abraham and left. Then Abraham took his son Ishmael and all his servants, whether houseborn or purchased, every male in the household, and circumcised them, cutting off their foreskins that very day, just as God had told him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised. His son Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised. Abraham and Ishmael were circumcised the same day together with all the servants of the household. Those born there and those purchased from outsiders, all were circumcised with him. Chapter 18. God appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamrie while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent. It was the hottest part of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing. He ran from his tent to greet them and bow before them. He said, Master, if it please you, stop for a while with your servant. I'll get some water so you can wash your feet. Rest under this tree. I'll get some food to refresh you on your way, since your travels have brought you across my path. They said, Certainly, go ahead. Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. He said, Hurry, get 3 cups of our best flour, knead it, and make bread. Then Abraham ran to the cattle pen and picked out a nice plump calf, and gave it to the servant, who lost no time getting it ready. Then he got curds and milk, brought them with the calf that had been roasted, set the meal before the men, and stood there under the tree while they ate. The men said to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? He said, In the tent. One of them said, I'm coming back about this time next year. When I arrive, your wife Sarah will have a son. Sarah was listening at the tent opening just behind the man. Abraham and Sarah were old by this time, very old. Sarah was far past the age for having babies. Sarah laughed within herself. An old woman like me get pregnant with this old man of a husband? God said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, me have a baby, an old woman like me? Is anything too hard for God? I'll be back about this time next year, and Sarah will have a baby. Sarah lied. She said, I didn't laugh, because she was afraid. But he said, yes, you did. You laughed. And that concludes today's reading, Genesis chapter 14, verse 13 through chapter 18, verse 15. And we continue to see God do crazy stuff. Sarah and Abraham were older than dirt, and yet God promised them a mighty nation. Kings would come from them. What kind of crazy stuff is God promising me? What about you? Yeah? What about Sarah? She laughed because she thought it was incredulous, unbelievable. Maybe she thought it was stupid. What about me? Do I believe what God has promised me? Do I think it'll never happen? I don't know. Hey, why don't you look us up over on Facebook, facebook.com, and just do a search for Andy Reads the Bible. We have a Facebook page, and we would welcome your comments over there. And if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. Put some comments on Facebook, Andy Reads the Bible. Today's episode is sponsored by Big Tree Telecom, where you can get a world-class phone system without all the hassle and expense. To learn more about how we can help your business talk big, visit us on the web at bigtreetele.com. That's bigtree, Tele.com.